Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Barbara Kyle, and I'm speaking to you from Ontario, Canada, from a small city called Guelph. In this webinar, I'm going to be telling you about the three things that agents, literary agents, and publishers want to see, really need to see, in the first 30 pages of your manuscript. And it's going to take us about half an hour. Thank you very much for joining me right on time. I appreciate that. But I know that there are a lot of people joining in from many different places all across North America. And also, I know there are some folks in Australia and Nigeria and Sweden. So I'm just going to give it a minute to make sure that everyone joins in and gets settled before I get started. Before we do get started, I want to know a little bit about you. Do you see on the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box, a Q&A icon. If you click that, you will be able to type in where you are joining in from. And I'd love to know, as I say, we have people from pretty much all around the world today. And so I'd love to see where everybody's joining in from. So please go ahead right now and just type into that Q&A box. And I see some people are already doing that. That's great. Okay, let me have a look here. Noriko is in New York. Patty is in Houston, Texas with an exclamation mark. Rebecca is in Pomona, California. Douglas in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Dwayne in San Jose, California. Trisha in Southwest Florida. So we have people, Helen in Scottsdale, Arizona. Tennessee. Wesley is in California also. Robin in Pennsylvania, Los Angeles, Vermont. Someone in Israel, isn't that lovely? Vicky in Venice, Florida. Oh, we have people from all over. Here's someone from Vancouver, BC. My husband is from Vancouver, BC. Lisa in North Carolina. Good, it's just great to see everybody. I'm just scrolling down here. Thank you so much for letting me know. Oh, here's someone, Kate in New Zealand. Atlanta, Kentucky. Thank you very much. I'm gonna close that box now. And but it's just wonderful to see everyone, as I said, all across North America and around the world. Good, thanks for that. I want to let you know that I will take your questions at the end of the webinar. As I say, the webinar is about half an hour. I'll take your questions at the end, at least some questions. I won't be able to get them all. And so type them in whenever you feel you have a question into that same box, into the Q&A box. And then when I get to the end of the webinar, I'll get to some of those questions. Good, so let's get started with the three things that agents and publishers really need to see in the first 30 pages of your manuscript. Let me make one thing very clear right at the top. There are no rules in writing. Any rule that's ever been made about writing has been broken by some writer somewhere to very good effect. So there are no rules, I think, but there are principles of storytelling that have shaped the art of storytelling for centuries. You know, a rule says, do this, but a principle says, this works, and it has worked through all of remembered time. So it behooves us as writers to be aware of these principles that work so that we can use them to best effect to make really compelling stories. Years ago, many years ago, actually, when I was just starting to write seriously, my mentor was Marian Fowler. She's an author, and Marian used to say, there's only one rule in writing, thou shalt not bore. Good advice. Marian Fowler was the writer in residence at the small library in the rural community where I used to live then. She was the one who really got me started on my writing career by critiquing my very first short story. It was pretty bad, but Marian helped me, and I rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, just as I'm sure that many of you are doing right now. That's our business, rewriting. And when I was finished, that story went on to win a competition, which made me very happy. Since then, I have had 10 novels published by major publishers in New York, and over 500,000 copies of my books have been sold worldwide. But it all began with that very first short story. And I'm so grateful to Marion for opening my eyes to what was possible. I think every writer needs a mentor. And I was very lucky to have Marion. And that's why I like to, as they say, pay it forward. So that's kind of what we're doing today. All right, let's have a look at the 3 crucial elements that need to be in your book's first 30 pages. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. If I can get my mouse to cooperate, there we go. No, I'm not pulling this up correctly. Let me try that again. Share my screen. Sorry, this is just taking a couple of minutes here. I thought I had this queued up with my PowerPoint, but maybe not. No, that's not working either. Okay, I'm gonna try one more time, then I'm gonna ignore this PowerPoint and I'll just talk to you. Let me try this one more time. Yeah, I'm not able to pull up my my PowerPoint here. Okay, I'm going to give up on that, and I'm just going to. I'm going to be giving you the same content, but you would have seen it with some pretty nice images. So I'm sorry that you're not going to see those. The first thing I want to talk about for the 3 things, the 3 crucial elements that need to be in your first 30 pages. Number 1, a clear, inciting incident. That's the first thing. The second is a main character that we can really care about. The third is mastery of effective dialogue to really enliven and enrich the action. I'll be giving you insights on all of these as we go through this webinar. But here's why I call these essentials. Agents and publishers are inundated with manuscripts. They read manuscripts all day, into the night, into the weekend. And so they want a story to captivate them immediately. If it doesn't do that in the first, 30, 20, 30, 35 pages type of thing, they may just stop reading. And I don't want that to happen to you. So let's start by talking about that first one, the inciting incident, a clear inciting incident. There's a Bruce Springsteen song, Dancing in the Dark, that has the lyric, "You can't start a fire without a spark." In any novel, there must be an event that sparks the story to life. That's what we call the inciting incident. Knowing where to start your story is really difficult. It's really important, but it's often a challenge to know really where to start your story. Often there are many places you might be able to start it. But a lot of new writers will make the mistake of starting a story with a lot of description about the characters, description about the settings, or they'll start with a lot of backstory. Backstory, of course, is the events that lead up to the main story. A book's opening is definitely not the place for backstory, and I don't think it's a place for much description either. And here's why. Readers cannot feel really involved with a character until they see them in action. Now, when I say action, I don't mean characters running around with guns. If you have that, that's fine, but certainly not all stories need to start that way. All I mean is that your main character is engaged already in something that matters to them. So whether you're writing a mystery or a romance, a thriller, sci-fi, maybe a YA fantasy, whatever your genre, introduce your main character when something vital to them is already at stake. It doesn't have to be, world hanging in the balance stakes. If it is, that's fine, but your story might not require that. But it does have to actually seem like that to the character. Here's an example. The opening paragraph of Maeve Binchy's novel Scarlet Feather introduces the main character, Kathy Scarlet. She's just opened her catering business, and she desperately wants to make a success of it. So in that first paragraph, in that first page, Kathy is on her way to cater the New Year's Eve party for her mother-in-law, her very wealthy, very powerful mother-in-law, who looks down on Kathy, who is the daughter of her maid. So Kathy is well aware of what she is up against this evening. She desperately wants to make a success of her new business, but she knows that her mother-in-law's antagonism can break her. So that's where we see Kathy on page 1. The point is that this character right away is engaged in something that really matters to her. And then the inciting incident of the story can happen. I like the phrase inciting incident because it suggests that necessary spark that starts a story. An event happens that incites the main character to take action. And because the phrase implies action, we as writers can't fool ourselves that in thinking that backstory or description constitutes an inciting incident. It doesn't. So what does make an inciting incident? Well, here's a definition. The inciting incident is the event that throws your protagonist's world out of balance. And what a character does to try to regain balance in their life is what the story is going to be all about. A person's life, of course, can be horribly upset by a murder or a call to war, or maybe by getting fired. But the event that incites the character does not have to be a negative one, not at all. Someone's life can be definitely upset and thrown off balance by winning the lottery, right? Or by getting married, or by going on a first date that changes their life. There was an author who lived many years ago who was very, very good at writing inciting incidents. And you might have heard of him. His name was William Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's play Hamlet, the inciting incident occurs in scene 4, and the first 3 scenes are very short. So scene 4, Hamlet has arrived home to visit his parents, come home from university, and he goes up on the battlements of the castle, and he is astounded at seeing the ghost of his dead father. When I say he's visiting his parents, it's his mother and his stepfather that he's visiting. So he sees the ghost of his dead father, who speaks to him. Hamlet's father tells him that he was actually murdered, and murdered by his own brother, Claudius, who is now the king and Hamlet's stepfather. So this extraordinary event of seeing the ghost and hearing him say these things to him totally upsets the balance of Hamlet's life. And it incites, from that moment on, his desire for revenge, his desire to avenge his father's murder. So everything, all the actions that Hamlet takes in this play, in his own very Hamlet-like way, nevertheless, he does take actions, and all of them spring from his desire that is incited by seeing that ghost, his desire to avenge his father's death. That's what the play is all about. Look at the inciting incident in another very famous story, The Wizard of Oz. The novel was written by L. Frank Baum and made, of course, into the iconic movie. The story begins with Dorothy living her normal life with her aunt and uncle on their Kansas farm. It's a very boring life in Dorothy's eyes, when a tornado strikes and sweeps her away. That is the inciting incident. Things happened before that, things that mattered very much to Dorothy, about her little dog Toto being in danger of being taken by Miss Galt. So lots of things that are already happening that matter to Dorothy. But the inciting incident is that tornado. That totally upsets the balance of her life, sweeping her off to Oz. And it incites also her need, her desire, her absolute need, actually, from the moment she arrives in the magical world of Oz to get back home. And she takes actions constantly to try to achieve that, to try to get back home. Look at the inciting incident in a much more recent best-selling novel, also made into a movie, Gone Girl. Gone Girl, this noir thriller by Gillian Flynn. At the beginning of that book, Nick Dunn wakes up on the morning of his 5th wedding anniversary to discover that his wife, Amy, has gone missing. That event totally upsets the balance of Nick's life, and all the actions that he takes are to try to regain balance in his life. Another example is The Goldfinch, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Donna Tartt. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize about 7 or 8 years ago, I think something like that. At the beginning of this book, teenager Theo Decker and his mother are at an art gallery in New York City, and they are caught in an explosion that kills her. It's not really a spoiler because it happens very near the beginning of this book. So in that horrifying moment, totally disorienting moment, it absolutely upsets the balance of Theo's life. And in that moment, in that disorientation, he grabs a painting off the wall. I have a feeling it's kind of something that might remind him of his mother in an inchoate way. And that action of grabbing that painting off the wall is going to haunt Theo for years through all of the pages of this huge story, The Goldfinch. Try to have your inciting incident happen as close to the opening of your novel as possible, but don't rush it. It doesn't have to be on page 1 or even on page 10 or 15. The most important thing, as I said earlier, is to give the reader someone to care about right away by seeing them engaged in something that matters to them. And then when the time is ripe, bring on your inciting incident that upsets the balance of your main character's life and incites them to take action. Write a powerful inciting incident, and it must follow as the night the day, that your character will lead you into their conflict, into their world, and into a very compelling story. Good. The second essential element that needs to be in your first 30 pages is all about your main character. It's their story you're telling. It's their struggle is what drives the narrative. So your goal is to create a main character that readers will care about. That's the second essential element, to create a main character right away that readers can care about. So how do you accomplish that? How do you create an engaging hero or heroine, a main character, a person who causes the events of a stirring story? I believe it all boils down to just one crucial quality: empathy. Empathy is what this is all about. It's about creating an emotional response in the reader, because emotion is how we understand things. Emotion is how we understand things deeply, how we remember things. It's how our brains work. We don't often remember abstractions. We remember something because we feel it. I actually believe that we humans are not thinking creatures who can feel. We are feeling creatures who can think. So the most essential characteristic of your protagonist, your main character, is that they elicit the reader's empathy. They don't necessarily have to elicit our sympathy. What's the difference? Well, sympathy means I feel for you, but empathy means I feel with you. I identify. Sympathetic rather, can also mean likable, but empathetic means like me. It means that deep down in that person, even an unlikable person, the reader can recognize a core of shared humanity. So it's not necessarily about being likable. We empathize for very, very personal things. A really great example of this is Don Corleone, the Godfather, in Mario Puzo's novel, The Godfather, made into the iconic movie and its sequels. In The Godfather, Don Corleone is not a nice person. He's a mafia boss who bribes judges. He buys politicians. He has people murdered. And yet we care about him. Why? It is because the author, Mario Puzo, very skillfully shows Don Corleone to us in ways that will make us care. At the book's very beginning, we see him as a devoted and loving family man, a devoted father, a man to whom family is paramount. And we instinctively warm to that. We can identify with that. Second, Mario Puzo shows us that the Don Corleone, uses violence only when he is pushed to do so, only when he's been hurt first. And we instinctively forgive him for that. And again, we can identify, hurt me and I'll fight back too. And third, we never see Don Corleone hurting anyone. He does all of his dark deeds off stage. So, although we know, of course, intellectually that he uses extreme violence, we don't see it, and so we don't feel it. Whereas we are shown very graphically the violence that the Don's enemies do to him and his family, people that he loves, like when his son Sonny, is gunned down. That we see in gory, graphic detail. And so we feel the Don's pain and his grief. We empathize. Another fine example of a character who is not especially likable, but definitely elicits our empathy, is Scarlett O'Hara, the heroine of Margaret Mitchell's Civil War saga, Gone with the Wind. She wrote it in, I think, 1936. And it was a huge bestseller, also made into a blockbuster movie. This book has now lost favor with the public because of its underlying racism. And I think that's an important and a necessary social development. Nevertheless, the study of the artistic creation of its heroine by Margaret Mitchell can still inspire us as writers on just a purely analytical level. So that's what I'm talking about. When Gone with the Wind opens, Scarlett O'Hara is a vain, spoiled, selfish girl. I think she's about 16 years old. But she is someone that the reader comes to care deeply about. How does Margaret Mitchell accomplish that? Partly it's because we get to see Scarlett's passions so deeply. Even when we don't approve of her, we understand her. We get her being in love almost to the point of obsession because, well, most of us have been in love. But right from the start, our empathy for Scarlett begins because other people, truly good people, like her. They feel real affection for her. Mammy likes her. Scarlett's father loves her, and so does her saintly mother. Even Melanie likes Scarlett. So the reader feels this kind of natural human response. If other people, good people, like this girl, well, there must be something about her. But perhaps the most important thing is that we feel along with Scarlett because she is such a forceful, willful person. There's not a moment in this great big saga in which this woman is passive. Scarlett inevitably takes action. Eventually, we get to know Scarlett almost as well as ourselves, and that creates the greatest empathy. But long before that, even when she is utterly selfish and scheming, we can't help admiring her because she is just so incredibly determined. I want to just mention to a few ways, 5 ways that I want to tell you about that you can create instant empathy for your main character. 5 ways that you can create empathy right away for your character before you really get into the main story even perhaps. First is make her good at her job. Whether she's a music teacher or a spy a Renaissance painter, a criminal lawyer, a butterfly collector, whatever. We all admire a person who does their job well. And we will feel that even for your main character, even though they're fictional, if someone who does their job well. Number 2, creating instant empathy. Give him a sense of humor. I don't mean he's a stand-up comic or even that he makes wisecracks all the time. I mean, he's just somebody who can smile about life. We all warm to such people and to such characters. Number 3, for creating instant empathy, make her the victim of undeserved misfortune. She's fired in a corporate cutback or ridiculed for her appearance, loses a loved one. Remember Stephen King's novel, Carrie? She was ridiculed at school and she responded in an unforgettably scary way. Number 4, as far as creating instant empathy, put him in physical jeopardy. You want to be careful with this one because you don't want to make him a passive victim. We may feel sorry for him, but to really engage us, to make us feel empathy, he's got to take action to get himself out of jeopardy. But it will always work. And number 5, for creating instant empathy, give her everyday foibles and flaws. She forgets people's names. She trips on the same step every time, something like that. Giving her everyday foibles or flaws like that will humanize her. Good. Now, let me tell you about the third essential element that needs to be in your first 30 pages. And that is you want to display, use some dynamic dialogue. Dialogue in a novel has a kind of magic because in a novel, dialogue is the only instance where there is no barrier between the character and the reader. There's no author giving descriptions and explanations. There's just the character expressing themselves in their unique voice. So they're kind of exposing themselves. They're almost naked because of their words. And that's why readers respond so intensely to dialogue. It feels alive. And that's exactly why agents and publishers, who are only human, want to see effective dialogue because they will respond to it the same way. And they want to see it, as I say, in your first 30 pages. There are several dramatic functions of dialogue. Let me give you 3 of the most important dramatic functions of dialogue. The first, of course, is to move the story forward. There are countless ways that dialogue does this. A character might reveal information, or they might admit something. They might incite another character to take some action. They might make accusations or defend themselves. They might argue their reasons. They might distract their listener. The possibilities, of course, are endless. But the point is that all stories are about conflict of some kind or other. And remember, conflict does not mean combat, doesn't mean fighting. Conflict just means problems. What problems does your main character have? So because all stories are about conflict, you want every section of dialogue to have some degree of tension in it, whether minimal or moderate or extreme. The second, the second important dramatic function of dialogue is to establish relationships. People speak differently to different people. For example, if you were going to tell your 13-year-old niece what you had learned in this webinar, you would use words, vocabulary, very different than if you were talking to a fellow writer, wouldn't you? So relationships take on a unique life through dialogue. And knowing this, you can use passages of dialogue strategically to highlight characters' relationships. The third important function of dialogue is to illuminate a character's individuality. This is lots of fun for us as writers to deal with. The goal, of course, is to create dialogue that is what we call character specific. It's pretty self-explanatory. Each character speaks in their own unique way. The vocabulary that a person uses their syntax, their grammar, all of it reveals a great deal about them. For example, the pedantic speech of an English professor is completely unlike the jargon of a kid living on the streets. I mean, look at just the different ways that people might express simple agreement. Someone might say simply, yes. For another, it's cool. Someone else, it might be whatever, or you got that right, or splendid notion. All of those are just ways of saying yes. And I'm sure you can think of dozens more, but it really reveals something about the character speaking them. It's also effective to pepper a character's dialogue with idioms that individualize them. You don't want to go overboard with this, but every now and then an idiom that is just theirs to individualize them. Words or phrases that are peculiar just to that person alone. An example is in John Irving's novel, The Cider House Rules. Dr. Larch, who runs an orphanage for boys, he has a favorite phrase that he often repeats to the orphan boys that he looks after. He often says, "You kings of New England, you princes of you princes of Maine, you kings of New England, you princes of Maine." Dr. Larch loves saying it, and the reader loves reading it and kind of hearing it. Another example is from The Princess Bride, the novel by William Goldman, made, of course, into a beloved comic movie. In The Princess Bride, there's one character who is always using the same phrase. It's inconceivable. He's got a bit of a lisp, so he says constantly, "It's inconceivable." And another character, he says this so often that another character finally says to him, "I do not think you understand the meaning of that word." One more note about writing dialogue is about body language. Body language is a living part of dialogue. By punctuating a sequence of dialogue with a character's body language or actions, you can really reveal something about their feelings. For example, a woman, fidgets with her wedding ring, or a man rakes his hand through his hair while he's thinking, or a girl covers her mouth to hide a smile. Gestures like this give rhythm to a scene, filling the silences between the character's spoken lines. So this fine tunes a scene's pacing by using body language and gestures. So those are the 3 essential elements that need to be in your first about 30 pages of your manuscript to intrigue agents and publishers to read on. Just do a quick review. The 3 things are: establish your story's inciting incident. Make sure it's very clear what the main character knows what they're up against and how their world has been unbalanced. The second is to ensure that we really care about your main character. Make us empathize. And finally, enliven and enrich the action with dialogue. I encourage you to have a look at my website, barbarakyle.com. And there you'll find lots more to help you on your writing journey. There are some free resources there. You can download a list of what I consider to be some of the best books about writing. And you can also check out my YouTube channel, where there are several videos, quite short videos, but really helpful for writers. And also you can see information about a series of masterclasses that I have coming up starting on February 2nd. I'd love to have you join me for those. So have a look at my website, barbarakyle.com, and you'll see all that information. Now we're just about out of time here. Actually, we are out of time, so I'll just take a couple of questions because I promised that I would. Someone sent in a question earlier that I thought was quite interesting. Tom asked me if I could spend a moment describing the difference, if any, between genres as to what is expected in the first 30 pages. So difference in genre. Specifically, he says, what characteristics of general expectation for plot, character, etc., might be unique to thrillers or sci-fi or romance, if there are any. That was a question that he sent me earlier. It's an interesting question. My answer would be there is nothing specific that is different about any of those genres for what needs to be in the first 30 pages. A clear inciting incident, a main character we care about, and the use of dynamic dialogue. So they would apply absolutely, Tom, to thrillers or to sci-fi or to romance or any other genre. The distinction, of course, when we drill down a little deeper, would be about tone. I think that it's pretty obvious that at the very top of a thriller or a sci-fi novel, you're going to have a tone of seriousness. Whereas in a romance, you might have a more lighthearted tone. So it's a matter of really what the characters are facing at the beginning of the story. The inciting incident in a thriller or in a sci-fi novel will pretty much be a big event, probably that has very little to do with that character's personal life. Whereas in a romance, the inciting incident will always be the meeting with the character who's going to become the beloved. So though that's pertinent to those three types of genre. But really, the three things I've talked about today absolutely have to be in any genre at all. And the only distinction, I think, would be about tone, which is how you're going to deal with that through your own style. Good. I'm just going to look at some other questions that people are putting into the box here. If I can just scroll down. I can get my mouse to work, but I can't get that PowerPoint to work. So, c'est la vie. Just scrolling through to find some of your questions here. Excuse me, getting a little closer to my screen with my poor old eyes. For dialogue, Greg is asking, dialogue, generally just he said rather than he yelled, emphasis should be in the dialogue itself. Interesting, good question, Greg. Verb, we call that the dialogue tag. It's called dialogue attribution or dialogue tag, the he said, she said part of writing dialogue. Usually you can get away almost always with said or asked or replied, very, very neutral verbs like that for a dialogue tag. The fancier the verb, the more elaborate the verb in the dialogue tag, the more it takes the readers takes the reader away from what the character is saying, because you have to think for a split second about what that means to be yelling or to be barking or to some other fancy verb. So I would recommend that you really stick with said, asked, replied, those types of very neutral verbs for dialogue tags. And don't be afraid if you see a page and it's got 13 saids on it in your dialogue. Don't worry, the word said is a magical word for readers. It simply disappears. The reader simply is looking at those words of dialogue that go straight into their brain, and they won't even notice that you said many, many times. Here's a question from Alisa. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Can my character's story jump back and forth chronologically? I keep hearing different opinions. Yes, totally, your story can jump back and forth chronologically. I would say the only, not rule, but the only principle here is clarity. Clarity for the reader. If you're going to be jumping back and forth in time, just make it very clear to the reader. Often authors will do this by putting the date right in, or by having in the character's thoughts, something like, I remember that day 10 years ago, it was 2 days after my birthday, something that's a trigger for the reader so that we're never confused about where we are. But absolutely, you can jump back and forth in a novel chronologically. And of course, we see this in films all the time. So it's only about clarity for the reader. As long as you're clear, your reader will follow you and love it. And I can take, what time is it here? Oh yeah, I can take just maybe 2 more questions here. Beverly's asking, how, if at all, do these apply to memoir? Great question, Beverly. When I work with writers as a mentor on writing their memoir, I always say the very same principles of storytelling apply to great memoirs. It's just storytelling. So the very same principles, and especially the ones that we've talked about today for the first 30 pages, absolutely apply. We need to care about your main character. We need to see that character in conflict that is meaningful. We need to have a climax of the story that is meaningful also, usually from the character from the person having learned something about life, an epiphany. That's usually the climax of a memoir. But the principles of storytelling, I think, are identical between great novels and great narrative nonfiction. And I'll take this last question. Do you prefer first person or question mark? That's a question from Lucy. I have no preference whatsoever. As a reader, and I think probably you're the same as a reader, and certainly this is true for agents and publishers, which is far more pertinent to what we're talking about today, whatever works. If you feel comfortable writing in first person, great. If you feel comfortable writing in third person limited, great. If you feel comfortable writing as an omniscient narrator, great. It's whatever works for your story. As long as you are, again, very much in control of that point of view, then your readers will never be confused about it. So getting a handle on point of view actually is a more difficult skill than a lot of new writers sometimes think. I talk about it a lot actually in the master classes coming up that I'm giving. But your question is right. It's not about, it's an interesting one. It's not about what anyone really prefers. It's that whatever works best for your story. For example, first person works really well for young adult novels. I think it might be because, as teenagers, my God, we're all so totally inward looking, right? All we can think about is ourselves as teenagers. So it's very, very useful for coming of age stories, for young adult novels, first person. Whereas a big, big saga probably is going to lend itself better to a point of view of omniscient narrator or of multiple third person. So really, it depends totally on the story you're writing, whatever works for your story. We're so past our time, so I'm going to say goodbye now. But I really appreciate you all joining me today. I hope it's been really helpful for you. I've enjoyed talking about it, as I always enjoy talking about writing to writers who care. Thank you for being with me, and I will say goodbye and happy writing.